tend to mean?
Very simply, it's supposed to measure the change in prices in consumer goods and services. And as designed and as reported, and I think the way most people think of it, it was intended as a measure of the cost of maintaining a constant standard of living. Using very simplistic terms, they'd measure a fixed basket of goods, so they'd measure a pound of beef, say a gallon of gas, a gallon of milk, whatever the price of that basket was. They'd then do the same thing the next year, and whatever the percentage change was there, that's how much your income had to have gone up by in order to have the same standard of living as you had the year before.
John, do you think that goods and services end up going through inflation, given that we use the currency that we do, paper currency? Do you agree with that? Or
I think we're effectively doomed to inflation. In fact, I think it's going to get a lot worse. If you look at inflation historically, Robert Starr of the University of Oregon publishes estimates on consumer prices before 1913. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the entity that publishes the CPI and also calculates the unemployment and employment measures that you'd mentioned earlier, publishes the CPI since 1913. SAR takes it from 1913 back to 1665 in the early American colonies. And what you'll see is that basically from 1665 up to the point of the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, it's actually its implementation, 1914, and up to the point where Franklin Roosevelt took us off the domestic gold standard, prices over almost 300 years there were very little changed. You did have periods of high inflation, usually around wars. You saw that around the American Revolution, the War of 1812, Civil War, World War I. But those periods of inflation were always followed by periods of deflation, and that tended to bring you back to a fairly constant level. For much of that time, that was due to the system being on a gold standard. The gold standard effectively imposed limits on what the governments could do and effectively controlled the money supply. But Mr. Roosevelt, Franklin, had a problem in the 30s, faced with a Great Depression, wanted to become Keynesian, spent a lot of money to buy the government out of, or to buy the country out of a terrible economic downturn, if possible. He couldn't do that under the gold standard, and that's why he eliminated the gold standard domestically. And the effective, I'll call it the debt standard, is what he put us on. And ever since, administration after administration generally has expanded the amount of debt, the amount of money, and at a pace that effectively dooms you to perpetual inflation. And at some point it gets out of control. Historically, over the last almost 2,000 years, there have been a very large number of fiat currencies where they're not backed by hard assets such as gold or silver. And all but the ones that are currently operating now, I mean, most of them have disappeared in hyperinflation or just virtually becoming worthless because the government's always found it too tempting to print a little extra money beyond what was backed by gold or silver, in fact, eventually making them fiat and just running wild with it. Again, I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. But with the CPI, in the early 90s, you had Mr. Greenspan, then Fed chairman, and Boskin, who was head of President Bush's, the first President Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, started putting forth a story as to how the Consumer Price Index overstated inflation. And if you ask them, well, how does it overstate inflation? The answer simply was, well, if steak gets too expensive, people will buy more hamburger, and if they buy more hamburger, then their cost of living is lower. And that's not reflected in the CPI. Well, of course it's not reflected in the CPI because that's contrary to the concept of measuring the cost of living of maintaining a constant standard of living. And having to switch from steak to hamburger or chicken because steak's gotten too expensive is not maintaining a constant standard of living. The average person wants a CPI measure that gives them a real estimate of what they need to stay ahead of inflation. And the old measure did it, but in the 90s, they started changing the system over to a substitution-based system.
What does that mean?
Instead of just measuring a pound of steak, in theory, and this is where they want to take it. People start buying more hamburger because it gets more expensive. They reduce the weight of steak and increase the weight of hamburger in the CPI. So it reflects people's behavior that's forced by rising prices, as opposed to measuring what people needed to get in the way of increased income to maintain, the constant that constant standard of living, buying the steak instead of being forced to buy hamburger.
Don't you think that most money managers and investors have not taken into account, when looking at what types of assets to get involved with, the inflation model that you're talking about?
Very few people look at the difference here in terms of their investment models or investment targets. And that's a very, very serious problem. The reason they wanted to do this, and it was expressed at the time, and we even heard it again most recently in the deficit reduction talks around the debt ceiling negotiations. Back in the early 90s, the idea is, well, if we can only reduce the reported rate of inflation, we can reduce the annual cost of living adjustments and Social Security, and with that we can reduce the deficit. And it was a way that the people in Congress could move to reduce the deficit without anyone having to do the politically impossible thing of voting against the deficit. That was the purpose behind it, and I take great offense at that, because I think you'd be doing much better to just be honest with people, say, hey, look, we're going to cut back on your cost of living adjustment, we can't afford it, as opposed to putting out a phony CPI number, which is relied upon by other people for contracts in terms of wage increases or rental increases, or for someone who's looking to invest and says, well, I want to at least beat the rate of inflation. If you're getting too low a number, you're not meeting the pace of increase that you need to stay ahead of inflation. And that's one thing that tends to puzzle people. Yeah, my income's going up, but I can only buy less with my income. I'm not staying even, not getting ahead. That's the reason.
Do you have something on your site once people join your newsletter? I don't know if it's part of the analysis behind and beyond government statistics, but do you have something that people can look at the correct inflation rate, some type of model? Because I know that most of the ones that they are using are wrong, really wrong.
My site is shadowstats.com, and I have alternate measures of the CPI, the unemployment rate, GDP. The graphs on that are publicly available. Anybody who wants to look at the headlines for in the current commentaries, I put out a weekly commentary. A lot of publicly available information, but if you look at the headlines, we always put the current number in the headlines. And what I do is I try to look at the CPI net of the changes that have been made in methodology. I use the government's estimate as to how much these different changes have knocked off the reported level of the consumer price index. And since 1980, it's about 5 percentage points. There's another 2 percentage points there from things that they don't think are methodological, and I'd argue that with them. Since 1990, it's a little over 3 percentage points if we just started at 1990 and the changes made since 1990. So somewhere between where the government's currently reporting inflation at 3.6%, somewhere between 7% and a little over 10% would be what my estimates are in terms of where the inflation would be if you were still measuring